When my grandmother moved out of her house in 1987, I helped her pack the kitchen. I was 12 years old, and I had no idea what most of it was. There was a tin of something called Crisco on the back of the pantry shelf. There were 2 bottles of something dark and sweet that turned out to be molasses. There was a paper bag of dried navy beans that looked like it had been there since before I was born. There was a tin of sardines in mustard sauce, a jar of pickled beets she had put up herself, a box of cornmeal that was half empty, and a can of something called Carnation Evaporated Milk that I had never seen in any kitchen I had been in before. She took all of it. Every single thing on that shelf came with her. I remember thinking that was strange, that she would move this particular collection of unfamiliar things to the new apartment. That these things were important enough to pack. Now I understand. Those were not just food. They were the infrastructure of a kitchen that knew how to feed people. Not ingredients that required a recipe to justify them, but staples that could become a dozen different things, depending on what else was on hand and who needed to be fed and how much time there was to do it. 20 of those foods are gone from most American kitchens now. This is where they went. I want to do something a little different at the start of this video. I want you to think about your pantry right now. Not to evaluate it, not to compare it to anything, just to picture it. Now think about your grandmother's pantry, or your mother's, or any 1950s kitchen you have ever seen in a photograph or a film. The difference between those 2 shelves is not just a list of different products. It is a fundamentally different philosophy about what food is for and how a kitchen works. The modern pantry is organized around meals, around specific recipes that call for specific ingredients that are purchased for that specific purpose and often used once and forgotten. The 1950s pantry was organized around capacity, around having the right tools on the shelf so that whatever the day required could be produced from what was already there. The 20 foods on this list were on every 1950s pantry shelf, not because they were fashionable or because a magazine recommended them. They were there because generations of American women had established, through experience, that these were the things that made a kitchen functional. The things that could be stretched, combined, preserved, and transformed. The things that fed families through the week and through lean times, and through the surprise of extra people at the table. They disappeared quietly. Not all at once. One by one, over about 20 years, each one was replaced by something more convenient, more processed, more expensive, and less capable. Let's go through all 20. Before we get into the list, subscribe to the channel and leave a like if you are the kind of person who thinks about where our food habits came from and what we gave up when we changed them. I put out a new video every day about the forgotten food traditions of American grandmothers. Hit the bell. Now let's open that pantry. Food 20. Lard. The can on the back shelf. White, solid, slightly translucent at room temperature. Rendered pork fat that had been the primary cooking fat of the American kitchen for the better part of 2 centuries before vegetable shortening and then vegetable oil replaced it in the 1960s and 1970s. Lard was not just a fat. It was a specific tool that produced specific results that nothing else has fully replicated. Lard makes the flakiest pie crust because its fat crystals are larger than butters and create more distinct layers in the dough. Lard fries at a higher smoke point than most vegetable oils, producing food that is crisp on the outside without absorbing excess grease. Lard makes biscuits that have a particular tender quality that Crisco approximates but does not match. The campaign against lard was driven primarily by the vegetable oil industry in the 1950s and 1960s, which funded research associating saturated animal fats with heart disease at a time when the science was genuinely contested. The replacement they sold, partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening, turned out to contain trans fats that are now understood to be significantly more harmful to cardiovascular health than the lard they replaced. The American Heart Association, which had endorsed the switch, eventually reversed its position on trans fats decades later. The lard can disappeared from most American pantries. The flaky pie crust went with it. Food 19. Dried navy beans and other dried legumes. The paper bag or the glass jar. Navy beans, pinto beans, black-eyed peas, split peas for the soup that simmered on the back of the stove on cold Mondays. Dried beans cost almost nothing in 1955, and they cost almost nothing now. They require time, soaking overnight, simmering for an hour or two, but not attention. You put them on and you do other things, and they become food. A pound of dried navy beans fed a family of 5 a substantial dinner and cost under 20 cents. The canned bean replaced them in most kitchens. Convenient, yes, but canned beans have been cooked twice by the time you open them, which changes their texture and their ability to absorb the flavors around them. A bean that has been simmered from dried in the same pot as the ham hock and the onion and the bay leaf has absorbed all of those flavors from the inside out. A canned bean added at the end of a recipe sits in the flavors, rather than becoming part of them. The dried bean also lasted indefinitely in a sealed container. The pantry that contained dried beans was a pantry that could produce a complete, satisfying, protein-rich meal at any moment, regardless of what else was available. That capability is mostly gone from modern kitchens, and we feel its absence every time we stare into the fridge at 6 o'clock with nothing planned. 18. Crisco vegetable shortening. This one is complicated because Crisco replaced lard, and then was itself largely replaced by liquid vegetable oils, and neither replacement was an improvement on what it displaced. But Crisco was on every 1950s shelf because it worked for specific things that nothing else did in quite the same way. It creamed with sugar in a way that produced a particular texture in cookies and cakes. It produced a stable, solid fat that could be stored at room temperature without refrigeration. It was marketed from its introduction in 1911 as the modern, clean, scientific alternative to animal fat, and it succeeded in establishing that identity so thoroughly that by the 1950s it was considered a kitchen essential. The original Crisco formula contained trans fats. It has since been reformulated. But the role it played in American baking, the specific texture it produced in a 1950s yellow cake or a batch of snickerdoodles, was not fully replicated when it was phased out by liquid oil in most everyday cooking. The baked goods changed. Nobody quite said why. 17. Molasses. The dark bottle in the back of the pantry. Blackstrap or regular, depending on the family. Molasses is what remains after sugar crystals have been extracted from sugarcane juice. It is intensely flavored, deeply sweet in a way that granulated sugar is not, and rich in iron and other minerals stripped out of white sugar by the refining process. In the 1950s American kitchen, molasses was used in gingerbread, in baked beans, in brown bread, in barbecue sauce before the bottled variety became standard, and as a sweetener in recipes that needed depth rather than just sweetness. A tablespoon of blackstrap molasses in a pot of beans added a complexity that sugar did not. It also kept indefinitely. The bottle on my grandmother's shelf had no expiration date, because molasses in a sealed container does not expire in any meaningful time frame. Molasses has been replaced by brown sugar in most recipes, which is white sugar with a small amount of molasses added back in at the factory. The bottle of molasses disappeared and the brown sugar bag appeared, and the connection between the two became invisible. Most people who bake with brown sugar have no idea they are using molasses. They just do not get to control the amount. Evaporated milk. The can with the 2 holes punched in the top by the church key opener. Evaporated milk. Whole milk with about 60% of its water removed by heating, then canned and sterilized, was a pantry staple in the 1950s because it provided the richness of cream at a fraction of the cost, and it stored without refrigeration until opened. It went into pumpkin pie filling, into cream soups, into coffee when fresh milk was not available, into fudge and caramel, and the kind of thick cocoa made on the stove. The Carnation brand can is the one I remember from my grandmother's shelf. The recipe for pumpkin pie on the back of the Carnation can was the pumpkin pie. Not a pumpkin pie, the one. The specific one that tasted like Thanksgiving. Evaporated milk has been replaced in most recipes by heavy cream or half and half, which are more expensive, less shelf-stable, and require refrigeration. The can of evaporated milk that could sit on the shelf for 2 years and be ready when you needed it is still available. It is in the baking aisle. Most people walk past it. 15. Cornmeal. Not the box of Jiffy corn muffin mix. The actual ground cornmeal in the paper bag. White or yellow, depending on regional tradition. Used for cornbread made in a cast iron skillet. For the crust on fried fish or chicken. For thickening soups and gravies when other thickeners were not available. For hush puppies. For the morning mush that some families ate before oatmeal became standard. Cornmeal in the 1950s American kitchen was a direct descendant of the cornmeal that had been in American kitchens since the colonial period. It required knowing what to do with it, how to make a proper cornbread batter, how to season a cast iron pan, how hot to get the oil for frying. That knowledge lived in the hands of the women who used it. When the knowledge stopped being passed down, the cornmeal stopped being purchased. The Jiffy box replaced it, because the Jiffy box required no knowledge. The Jiffy cornbread is not bad. It is just not the same thing. And the person who learns to make cornbread from a Jiffy box does not learn how to make cornbread. They learn how to use a Jiffy box. Food 14. Bacon drippings. Not a purchased product, a saved byproduct. The small tin or ceramic crock beside the stove that received the fat rendered from cooking bacon. Strained as it cooled, stored at room temperature, used over the following weeks to fry eggs, to season green beans, to make gravy, to grease the cornbread pan. Bacon drippings added a specific flavor to everything they touched. A deep, smoky, savory quality that vegetable oil cannot replicate, and that butter only partially approaches. The green beans, slow cooked with bacon drippings, tasted different from green beans cooked in any other fat. Not because of calories or nutrition, but because of flavor chemistry specific to rendered pork fat. The practice of saving drippings died when the narrative about animal fats shifted. The can went away. The flavor went with it. American green beans became milder. Nobody quite noticed because the change was gradual. The practice of saving bacon drippings costs nothing and requires only the habit of saving rather than pouring down the drain. It is recoverable. The knowledge of what to do with them is less so. Food 13. Dried herbs in small tins. Not the bottles of 30 imported spices. The small flat tins of dried herbs. Thyme, sage, marjoram, dried parsley, bay leaves, that supplemented or replaced fresh herbs in winter. Every American kitchen in the 1950s had a small collection of these tins. Not a spice rack of 30 varieties. 4 or 5 herbs that went into specific dishes and were replenished when they ran out. dried thyme for roasted chicken and soups, dried sage for the turkey stuffing and the pork sausage, marjoram for the pot roast. These were not gourmet ingredients. They were functional ones. A piece of chicken roasted with dried thyme and a little salt, and the fat it sat in, tasted like it was supposed to taste. It did not require a recipe. The small herb tins have been replaced by a proliferation of spice options so extensive that most home cooks own 30 varieties they use twice a year each. The function of having 4 herbs you know how to use has been replaced by the aspiration of having 30 herbs you might use someday. Food 12. Rolled oats. The actual kind. We covered this in the breakfast video, but it belongs on this list because it was a pantry staple with uses beyond breakfast. Oatmeal in the 1950s kitchen went into cookies, into the topping for fruit crisps, into meatloaf as a filler that stretched the meat further without anyone calling it a filler, into the morning porridge that started the day 5 days a week. The cardboard canister of Quaker rolled oats was on every shelf. Not the instant packets, the oats that required 10 minutes of actual cooking. A canister lasted months. It required nothing to maintain. It was ready whenever the cookies needed to happen, or the meatloaf needed stretching, or the Tuesday morning breakfast needed to come together in 10 minutes. Instant oatmeal replaced it in many kitchens because instant oatmeal is faster. The versatility was largely lost with it because nobody puts instant oatmeal in meatloaf. Food 11. Vinegar. White and apple cider. 2 bottles. Both were on every shelf. The white vinegar cleaned things. It went into the pickle brine, into the canning liquid, into the final rinse of laundry for delicates. It was as much a cleaning product as a food product, and it cost almost nothing. The apple cider vinegar went into salad dressings made from scratch, into the braising liquid for pot roast, into the coleslaw, into the barbecue sauce, into certain baked goods where acid was needed to activate the baking soda. It had a specific flavor that white wine vinegar approximates but does not match. Rounder, less sharp, with a faint sweetness from the apple. Both bottles lasted indefinitely. The apple cider vinegar disappeared from most cooking pantries and returned about 15 years ago as a health supplement rather than a cooking ingredient, which has changed how people relate to it. You take it in the morning as medicine. You do not splash it into the coleslaw dressing the way it was always meant to be used. Food 10. Canned tomatoes in quantity. Not the fresh tomatoes for salads, the cans, multiple cans. Whole tomatoes and crushed tomatoes were on every shelf in quantity because they were the base for more dishes than any other single ingredient. Soup, stew, the sauce for meatloaf, the braising liquid for pot roast, the base for the chili that fed 12 people at the church supper. This one has not disappeared entirely. Canned tomatoes are still available. What has changed is the relationship to them. From staple kept in quantity to occasional purchase made for a specific recipe. The modern kitchen buys 1 can for 1 dish. The 1950s pantry maintained a stock that could produce 10 different dishes without another trip to the store. Food 9. Baking soda and baking powder in quantity. Not the single box, multiple boxes. Baking soda and baking powder were used daily in a 1950s kitchen that baked its own bread, made its own biscuits, produced its own pancakes and waffles on weekend mornings, and made cakes and cookies for occasions. The shift away from home baking that accelerated in the 1960s with the rise of packaged mixes and commercial bread reduced consumption of these 2 ingredients dramatically. The box of Arm & Hammer that now sits in most refrigerators as a deodorizer was once kept on the baking shelf and replaced monthly because it was used up. When the baking went away, The baking soda stopped running out. The single box in the fridge became the symbol of a kitchen that had lost one of its primary functions. Food 8. Salt. Pork and ham hocks. The package in the refrigerator or the piece kept in brine. Salt pork, cured pork belly, similar to bacon but typically not smoked, was used primarily as a flavoring agent. A small piece rendered in the pot before the green beans went in. A chunk simmered with the dried beans for the Monday soup. Ham hocks served a similar purpose. The bony, collagen-rich piece of the pig's leg that produces a deeply flavored broth when simmered for hours with dried beans or greens. A ham hock and a pound of dried navy beans and some water and some onion and some thyme made a pot of food that fed a family of 4 for dinner and provided leftovers for the next day. Salt pork has nearly disappeared from American cooking. Ham hocks are still available, but are less commonly used. The flavors they produced cannot be substituted. A pot of beans made with chicken broth instead of a ham hock tastes like a different dish. The original thing is largely gone. Food 7. Unflavored gelatin. The red Knox box. The red box in the baking aisle. Unflavored gelatin was used in the 1950s kitchen for aspics and molded salads, for homemade gelatin desserts before Jell-O made the flavored version dominant, for clarifying stocks and broths, and for certain pie fillings that needed to set without baking. The molded aspic has almost entirely disappeared from American cooking, which is probably for the best aesthetically. But the unflavored gelatin itself remains one of the more useful pantry items available. For adding body to homemade broth, for making panna cotta, for setting cream pies without baking. It costs almost nothing. It lasts indefinitely. Most people have never used it. Food 6. Worcestershire sauce. The thin, dark bottle with the yellow label. Worcestershire sauce was on every 1950s shelf because it performed a function that nothing else replicated. It added complex, savory, fermented depth to meat dishes, gravies, and stews without asserting itself. You could taste the dish was better without being able to name why. A few drops in the pot roast braising liquid, a tablespoon in the meatloaf, a splash in the hamburger before it went in the pan. Worcestershire was the umami amplifier of the 1950s kitchen before anyone used that word. It is still available. It has become a specialty item, something people buy for a specific recipe, rather than a staple added to dozens of dishes per month by instinct. The instinctive use of it is gone. That particular knowledge did not get passed down. Food 5. Pilot bread and plain, shelf-stable crackers. The flat, dense, nearly indestructible crackers that appeared when the bread had run out. Pilot bread and the various commercial versions of shelf-stable flat crackers served one function. They were the base for anything that needed to be spread on something solid. And they lasted indefinitely. Butter. Peanut butter. The last of the sardines. A slice of cheese. They did not go stale. They did not grow mold. They were there when the fresh bread was gone. The cracker aisle today contains hundreds of options and dozens of flavors, most of which are heavily seasoned, quickly staled, and designed for immediate consumption rather than shelf stability. The simple, plain, durable cracker that could hold anything and last for months has been largely replaced by products that are more interesting and less functional. Food 4. Fruit preserves put up at home. The glass jars with the paraffin seal, lined up on the pantry shelf by type. Apple butter, strawberry jam, grape jelly, peach preserves, green tomato relish at the end of summer. Home canning and preserving was not a hobby in the 1950s. It was the mechanism by which summer abundance was converted into winter food. The garden produced more tomatoes than could be eaten fresh. The apple tree dropped more fruit than could be used in a week. The putting up of food was the work that made winter eating possible. A jar of apple butter from September lasted into February. It tasted like the particular summer that produced it. Home canning has had a revival in recent decades as a hobby, but the relationship to it has changed. It is now an optional activity undertaken for pleasure or self-sufficiency. In the 1950s kitchen, it was not optional. It was how you ate in February. Food 3. Dried sage and the herbs you actually used regularly. I want to single out sage specifically. Dried sage was in every 1950s American kitchen because it went into the turkey stuffing every November, and into the pork sausage, and into the bean soups, and into the pan with pork chops. Those applications alone justified a regular supply. Dried sage from the little tin was one of the primary flavors of American home cooking. It is still available. Most people under 50 do not use it regularly and do not know what to do with it. The herb knowledge, which herb goes with which protein, how much, when in the cooking process to add it, was not written down anywhere. It lived in the cook. When the cook stopped being watched, the knowledge stopped being transferred. Food 2. Canned salmon and sardines. The flat tins. Salmon for the salmon patties on Friday. Sardines in mustard sauce for the crackers and the quick lunch. Canned salmon and sardines provided complete, inexpensive protein that required no refrigeration, no preparation beyond opening the can. The salmon patties. Canned salmon mixed with egg and breadcrumbs and fried in a pan were Friday dinner. They took 15 minutes. They cost almost nothing. Canned fish has experienced a revival as a premium product in recent years, with imported sardines commanding prices the 1950s can would not have justified. The premium product is different from the pantry staple. The old relationship, the can on the shelf as infrastructure, as the Friday night protein before anyone called it a seafood dinner, is gone. Food 1. The leftover with a plan for it. This is the one that is hardest to name because it was not a specific food. It was a relationship with food. In the 1950s American kitchen, there was no leftover without a plan. The pot roast became the hash. The chicken became the soup. The extra mashed potatoes became the croquettes fried in bacon drippings on Thursday. The leftover cornbread became the dressing for Sunday. The extra beans became the soup that stretched through the week. Nothing went into the refrigerator without a plan for what it would become next. The plan was not written down. It was knowledge carried in the cook's head about what could be combined with what and when and how. The modern refrigerator is a holding space for food that might be eaten. The plan is gone. The food that does not get eaten in time gets thrown away. The USDA estimates American households waste between 30 and 40% of the food they purchase. The 1950s kitchen, operating on a tight budget with no margin for waste, lost almost none. The food has not changed. The relationship with the food has changed. And the relationship is the thing that cannot be packaged and sold. Looking at these 20 foods, I notice that what connects most of them is not that they are old-fashioned or that they require special skills. What connects them is that they required a relationship with the food itself, with its properties and its possibilities and its limitations. A relationship with the pantry as a system rather than a collection of individual purchases. The lard required knowing what it was good for. The dried beans required knowing how to use time as a cooking tool. The bacon drippings required the habit of saving rather than discarding. The apple butter required understanding summer abundance as something to be converted rather than consumed immediately. Each of these foods came with knowledge attached. When the food left, the knowledge left with it. And you cannot buy the knowledge back. You can only recover it by doing the thing again until the doing becomes habit and the habit becomes instinct. My grandmother packed that pantry shelf because she understood that those things were not just food. They were her capability. Her ability to feed whoever showed up at whatever time with whatever she had. That capability is worth recovering. 20 foods. A can of lard and some dried beans, and a bottle of molasses and a tin of evaporated milk, and a bag of cornmeal and a crock of bacon drippings, and a few flat tins of herbs, and a red box of gelatin, and a bottle of Worcestershire, and some fruit put up from the summer garden. None of these were luxuries. None of them required special equipment. They required a kitchen that understood what it was for and stocked itself accordingly. The foods themselves are mostly still available. The relationship with them is what is gone. The knowledge of what to do with a pound of dried navy beans at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday, without a recipe, without a plan made that morning, without anything except what is on the shelf and what you know. That is what quietly left when these 20 things left. Leave a comment below and tell me, which one of these do you remember from a kitchen you grew up in? Which one did you recognize and then realize you have not thought about in 20 years? Those comments are the best part of this channel. Tell me what you remember. Like the video if it made you think about your pantry differently. Subscribe for more of this every day. The kitchen hasn't forgotten. We have.